Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to those of you who are joining us live, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us via the live stream. My name's Andrew Curran. I'm HSE's Chief Scientific Advisor and Director of Research. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this evening meeting of the Royal Society. Obviously, one of the things that we're keen to learn about is how modelling has helped us understand the issues around the pandemic. And we have a fantastic array of speakers for you this evening. Before I get to the speakers, you'll hopefully be able to see that we have a QR code on screen and a link to the Slido app for the event. We'll be taking any questions for this evening's event through Slido. That's both in the room and online. So if you haven't got the Slido app on your phones or your devices, I suggest you download them now, because that's where the questions will be coming from later on. This evening event marks the end of a day where we've heard from a range of different individuals involved in modelling around the pandemic, and I think it's been very clear to me that there's been a huge contribution made by modelling scientists during our national response to the global pandemic. And one thing that's really struck me is the diversity of scientific backgrounds that have been drawn on to help provide data sets that perhaps previously wouldn't have been thought about to inform that modelling approach. That includes everything from epidemiological modelling to human behavioural modelling and environmental modelling. The event that we've had today and continue into this evening has been held in collaboration with the Royal Society, the RAMP initiative put in place by the Royal Society themselves, and the Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences. As I mentioned, I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Health and Safety Executive, and one of the things I was asked to do in introducing this evening's event was to just say a little bit about what I did during the pandemic. And I guess that's going to be a question that our grandchildren, our children are asking us for years to come. But I think sometimes people don't realise that the Health and Safety Executive has quite a large science capability. In the context of the pandemic, we were very much involved early doors thinking about how to facilitate testing, given that SARS-CoV-2 is a microorganism that needs particular kinds of high-level handling. And then involved in looking at the market surveillance for personal protective equipment to make absolutely certain that any protective equipment coming into the UK protected the people who wore it. But when I was thinking about the specific question about what I did, I thought, well, actually I was probably uniquely placed because I was a SAGE participant. I attended the vast majority of the SAGE meetings. I was a subgroup of SAGE co-chair. So I co-chaired the Environment and Modelling subgroup of SAGE and actually set that up with Kath Noakes from the University of Leeds. I am leading one of the national core studies on COVID, which is looking at the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. And I'm obviously a departmental chief scientific advisor providing advice into government, translating all of that evidence into information that hopefully helps support policymakers and politicians. So I think I've been in a very interesting position at that interface between policy and science. And I think that might be one of the themes that comes out from tonight. We'll see from the very distinguished list of speakers that we have. And as I mentioned, we have three fantastic speakers, starting with Professor Adam Kucharski from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, moving on to Professor Chris Budd from the University of Bath, and then completing the triumvirate with Dr. Louise Dyson from the University of Warwick. Hopefully that should give us some really interesting insights, because then we'll be able to end up with a panel discussion. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Adam Kucharski to the stage, and he's going to tell us about how to make sense of pandemic dynamics. So Adam, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So, how do we make sense of a pandemic? I'm sure that's a question that a lot of us have been asking over the past couple of years. And it's one that mathematical models can be a very useful tool in helping us answer. And what I want to do this evening is give an overview of some of the different models that have been used, some of the applications that came up during COVID. But When we're talking about models, I think sometimes for people it conjures up this image of this big, complex, opaque algorithm that tries to predict the future. And when we see modelling discussed and modelling results come out, it's this big algorithm that's throwing all these things out. But the reality is often very different. Over the pandemic, my colleagues and I at London School have worked on a whole range of different questions, produced dozens of different models, working on everything from the basic features of the biology of the infection, questions like if you get infected today, what's the probability you'll test PCR positive 2 days later? What's the extent of pre-symptomatic transmission? What's going on with super spreading? Looking at things like control measures at different scales. What happens if quarantine policies change? What happens if different population level measures come in? So a real whole diversity of work and models going on. And then alongside that, also a whole range of people working on it. This isn't the case that we've got this big model and a couple of people turning the handle. Within London School, for example, these are the people who made up the modelling working group, and there's many colleagues, other universities, other groups around the world, and really I'd like to acknowledge all the work I'm presenting is the work of this huge effort that's been going on within the UK and globally. But if we're interested in epidemics, interested in pandemic dynamics, there's two broad questions that I think we can often put what we care about under. The first is what we're dealing with. What's the characteristics of the infection? What are its properties for making people ill? And secondly, what can we do about it? If we have an infection with given characteristics, what are our control options? What might the implications of those different strategies be for the epidemic? So let's start off with what we're dealing with. So I'm going to take you back to the early stages of 2020. In Wuhan, 41 cases of a novel coronavirus had so far been reported. But something looked a bit odd, because by that point, 3 cases had been detected abroad, in travellers, 2 in travellers to Thailand, 1 from Japan. Now, 41 people have so far been infected in Wuhan. How plausible is it we would have already seen 3 cases be detected abroad? And perhaps another way of phrasing it is, how many cases do we think are more consistent with already seeing 3 cases abroad? Well, we can construct a simple model to think about that. Because, if you have a city, only a given proportion of people travel on each day, and we can have some idea of the travel fluxes between locations. And then we can say, well, if 3 cases have been abroad, given what we know about the amount of travel that happens on average from a city, we can get some rough estimate of what that might mean for the extent of infection. And that's exactly what the group at Imperial College did with this kind of probability-based modelling approach of travel. And they estimated that there were probably already thousands of cases in Wuhan, far more than the 41 so far reported. And we saw very quickly after that the number of reported cases surged, and it was a much larger epidemic. We now know that these estimates were far more consistent with what was going on, despite the simple model, despite the uncertainty. Now, of course, that model doesn't capture every single feature of what's going on in human interactions and social structure in Wuhan, but it still tells us something valuable. And a colleague of mine, Seb Funk, when he teaches mathematical modelling, likes to show this quote, and I think it's useful, so I'll show it too. It's a quote by Picasso, and if you look at an abstract piece by Picasso, he's not trying to reproduce reality. He's not trying to make a photograph. What he's doing is he's taking reality, stripping away the features, and leaving us with the features that we care about, and the features that can give us an insight that we might not have seen just by looking at what we think is obvious. And models can do something similar. Models are not reality. That imperial model wasn't the full complexity of reality. But by distilling it down into a simplification, it could give us an insight that we wouldn't have got just by looking at the raw data. I think that's where a lot of the value of models comes in. And particularly during an epidemic, we have this problem that the data we're dealing with, not just for COVID, every epidemic I've worked on, it's going to be delayed, it's going to have biases, it's only going to represent certain groups, it's going to be incomplete, it's going to be patchy. The databases, even with a lot of time, are going to have these features that will cause problems. And the difficulty is, if we're interested in the epidemic dynamics, if we're interested in transmission, what we really care about is when infections are occurring over on the left. But particularly early on for something like COVID, we were typically observing the more severe outcomes, things like hospitalizations and deaths that were often weeks after those original infection events. So we're always looking backwards. We're not necessarily seeing all these groups that were really interested in to understand what's happening at that point in time. And that makes it hard to understand what's going on and what the implications might be. If we look after that initial realization about the size of the epidemic in Wuhan, these strict shutdown type measures were put in place. Really unprecedented. In 1918, there were sort of partial shutdowns of society had happened, particularly in the US, and it brought down transmission, sort of slowed it down, but not brought it down substantially. But in China, this was really scenes that we had never seen before, certainly in the modern era for infectious diseases. So what was happening? What effect might it have? Well, we had this problem of the lags in the data, that hospitalizations, cases would take some time. So what we did is combined international travellers, much like the Imperial analysis, with the reported case data, with data as well from evacuation flights on Wuhan, where everybody was being tested, if you remember, people being flown back to different countries. And that gave a sense of how many infections might be undetected. And what that allowed us to do was get an estimate of how the reproduction number was changing over time. So probably very familiar with it, just a reminder, reproduction number is defined as, for a typical infectious individual, how many secondary cases do they generate on average? How many people do they go on to infect? So in this analysis, combining these different patchy bits of data, a lot of uncertainty, but we estimated the reproduction number was probably bobbling around sort of 3 or so. But around the time the shutdown came in, the red line here, we saw this clear drop in what was happening with the reproduction number. And that couldn't be explained by substantial infection and build-up immunity in the population. We estimated probably only 5% or so of Wuhan had been infected by the end of January. So it seemed that something dramatic was changing in transmission during that period. And over time, we saw that coming in through case data and other sources. It's now obvious that we saw this peak coinciding with these measures. But at the time, a lot of uncertainty around what impact were these measures actually having. And that wasn't the only uncertainty we had during this period. Another one was actually just what's the severity of the infection we're dealing with. And one of the challenges is, if you look at, for example, the early case and death data, if we wanted to start with maybe a really simplistic calculation, we might think, well, why don't we just look at the number of deaths that have been reported in a given period, the numbers of cases, and then just the ratio of those two things gives us an estimate of the fatality risk for the infection. The problem, of course, with that calculation is it takes time for cases to turn into severe disease. So if, for example, you have 100 people turn up to hospital on a given day and none of them have died yet, it doesn't mean the fatality risk is zero. If you wait over time, you're going to see those outcomes appear. And if you look at the early China data, if you look at the earlier time points where this wait-and-see period has elapsed, you end up with a case fatality rate of about 15%. So is it really plausible, given what we were starting to see internationally, that we were dealing with something where 15% of people with symptoms die? Well, the problem is, as well as delay, you're also not detecting all of your infections. So you need some way of working out how many infections are you missing, how many outcomes are you having, the fact these might be in different age groups, different populations, how do you combine all of that information? And models provide a really nice skeleton for bringing together those fragments of data to get something that gives the value we're interested in. And this is what happened during the early periods, some work by Hong Kong U, Imperial, we did some work as well. Two of these studies using evacuation flights that had this mass testing of passengers. We did some work with Diamond Princess data, where there was, if you remember, this cruise ship, large outbreak and extensive testing. And all of these converge on very similar estimates of the case fatality for symptoms, and then where available, similar estimates in China on average so far for the infection fatality risk. So slightly different methods, different data sets, but giving us this insight using models and these disparate data into this value we care about. And obviously over the coming weeks, we saw this become very clear in countries with growing epidemics, places like Europe, just how severe this thing can be when you get growing cases within a population. And this led to a lot of countries adopting different measures, some variation in some cases of what happened in China, other countries going their own way, and in many countries, cases started to peak and come down. But then that raised the question of, why did COVID decline? If a reproduction number is coming down, what's the explanation for that? And the challenge we have is that there's a few different things that influence a reproduction number. So think of someone who's become infected. What influences how many other people they spread that infection to? The first thing it depends on is how long they're infectious for. What's their duration that they're out and about potentially infecting people? Also depends on what they do during that infectious period. How many opportunities are there to infect other people? But it also depends on what kind of interaction that is. Are they meeting someone indoors, outdoors? Are people wearing masks, for example? So it's the transmission probability during an interaction that also influences R. And then finally, the susceptibility. If a bunch of people have just recently been vaccinated, there might be virus, there might be interactions, but that susceptibility is going to be different. So I like to call these things the dots for short. So the 4 things I mentioned: duration of infectiousness, opportunities, transmission probability, susceptibility. 4 things that influence the reproduction number. And if you think through these stages of how transmission happens, if you multiply them together, you get the reproduction number. You know, if people have twice as many opportunities on average, we'd expect twice as many secondary cases. If you bring down susceptibility by a certain proportion, you'd expect the same effect on the reproduction number. But the challenge this creates is if we look at a change in R, there's 4 different things that could have influenced this. If you scale up or down one of these 4 things, all of them could scale R up and down in a certain manner. And just to illustrate the challenge we have here, let's look at some just really kind of toy, very simple models that I built. So the first model here is just, chapter 1 of a textbook, very simple epidemic model, no change in behavior, no control measures. Epidemic starts to increase, immunity accumulates as people become infected. Eventually, that immunity starts to put a brake on the infections. You get a peak, epidemic starts to come down. So for those of you who've come across these textbooks, it's referred to as an SIR model. So if you think about the dots, it's really S doing the work in bringing this down. As it comes up, S is declining, you've got fewer susceptibles, and that's bringing down the reproduction number, so you eventually get a peak and it comes down. Next, let's build a different model. Let's build a model where, rather than there being a lot of infection, and here in this model, I'm assuming there's a lot of undetected infections, so what you're seeing in cases, this break comes in quite early. Let's assume you detect more cases and people change behavior really dramatically. So in this model, it's opportunities that are coming down gradually in this middle of the epidemic period, and that's bringing the epidemic under control. Now let's look at a third model where opportunities, behavior stays the same, but the transmission risk during those opportunities changes. So here, it's perhaps seasonal effects. You've got a big change in climate that's affecting people's behavior, more outdoor mixing, perhaps effect on viral properties as well. And it's this T transmission probability that's coming down and bringing the epidemic under to much lower levels. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted that all 3 of these pictures look identical. These are genuinely 3 different models. But what I've done is I've tweaked the assumptions in those models so they all produce the same number of reported cases over time under these 3 different mechanisms. And what we call this in statistics is the problem of identifiability. If we just look at case curves, we can't identify which of these explanations is the correct one, because we can build a model that generates this same pattern for 3 completely different explanations. And I think if you think back to sort of 2020, a lot of the arguments that were going on about why epidemics were declining, a lot of it came down to this. That you had people arguing by staring at case curves, and even if they'd argued for like a decade, they wouldn't have been able to resolve it because you could have something that's consistent with all these explanations. So what can you do about it? Well, we need to look at additional data sources. We need to look at things that can give us some insight into what these components of the reproduction number, what these different, the D, O, T, and S are doing. So one way of doing this, for example, is just to go out and measure behavior. If it's opportunities, we should be able to measure a change in contacts. And one thing some of my colleagues led at London School was a study measuring social contacts within a population. So here, it's known as the COMIC study, and on the top, we've got the participant ages along the bottom, and then the ages of the people they report contact with on a given day on the vertical. And the colour just shows the number of contacts one age group reporting with another. So you can see on the right, pre-COVID, a lot of mixing between children, generally age groups mixed with similar age groups. You can, if you squint, you can see parents mixing with younger kids in there. Post-lockdown, massive drop in contacts, about 75% reduction in average daily contacts. And what you can do is construct a simple model where if you have this age group mixing with this age group, you can start to work out, on average, how much transmission will propagate forward in the population. And you can get an estimate of the average amount of secondary cases, which we know is the reproduction number. And what my colleagues found was whether you use conversational contacts or whether it's physical interactions, handshakes, hugs, this sort of thing, in both cases, the reduction in social behavior was likely enough to bring the reproduction number below 1. So this survey post-lockdown was done in that last week of March. And it was one of the first signals that the lockdown in the UK would likely bring down transmission. Weeks later, we saw cases start to decline, we saw hospitalizations decline, but it was really these early signals that provided some insights into which of these explanations was responsible. And this survey continued, and if we look at the R estimates from Comix, this is the dots in red here, are social mixing data estimates, and overlaid with estimates from REACT, which is this study of random individuals regardless of symptoms in the community. So there's REACT1 is one of these studies, ONS is another one you're probably familiar with. You can see that the trend generally lines up quite well, that where we see change in social mixing, that's mirrored in changes we see in infection within the community. So a lot of what was happening in the dynamics during that 2020 period was driven by changes in social behaviour. But that meant that there was still a lot of susceptibility in the population. As things started increasing into the autumn, potentially we were going to face a problem. But not everyone concluded that it was a problem during this period. And I mean, I think as a scientist who works in epidemic dynamics, I kind of found it a bit astonishing that we had the situation where we had much, much better data than we had earlier in the pandemic. We had this knowledge of things like the lags we have in data, features of exponential growth where things can contagion each round can grow and grow and get larger and larger. We had this understanding that cases can get into older risk groups and those will turn to hospitalizations further down the line. But you had these very confident, I mean, even dates in these, some of these like well into October, November. And I think a lot of this misinterpretation and just noise going out there just was summed up very nicely by this quote by Tom Whipple at the end of 2020, which was saying, in that period, we faced a really bad second wave, and we had some tough decisions to make as a country about what we wanted to do, what we wanted the trade-offs to be. And largely, we didn't have those proper discussions because everyone got so distracted by just nonsense claims about what was right there in front of us. Or right there in front of us if we just use a bit of understanding about how epidemics work. And I think as well as just this sort of noise of the debate, it also illustrated the importance of thinking through some of these issues with modelling, around delayed outcomes, around things like exponential growth. And I think I would argue that basically anyone who has an opinion about COVID is using a model, because they're making assumptions about how they think the epidemic works, what they think is driving transmission, and they're drawing conclusions based on those assumptions. Often they won't realise they're using a model. They might not even realise in their head they have a conceptual idea of what the epidemic is doing. But if they're making a statement about dynamics, implicitly they are making some assumptions, but they're not writing them down. They're not thinking through which of these assumptions is reasonable. And actually, when we do epidemic modelling, sometimes the most important insights come way before we go to a computer and do any simulations. It becomes when we write down our assumptions and think through, what do we know? What don't we know? What are our knowledge gaps? Where are the bits where we think we might get something a bit counterintuitive or potentially something that will challenge our existing knowledge? And that becomes particularly important when we start thinking about control measures, of what we want to do about things. Because what feels intuitively obvious might not be the actual reality of how something plays out in terms of control. So what kind of control options have been adopted during COVID? Well, early on, a lot of focus was on targeted control. So this is where you put your energy at where you know infections currently are and people currently at risk. So at the moment, monkeypox would be an example of something where targeted control is going on. Our daily lives are not being changed because of a response to monkeypox. The effort is being concentrated where infections are. But COVID has features that make that challenging. So if we look at an individual who's infectious and what happens, they get infected. For the original variant, you had about 3 days or so before they became infectious, about 5 days before they became symptomatic, and then stopped becoming infectious a few days later. So they could potentially infect someone else quite early on. And then that contact could themselves become infectious. And that really put control against the clock, because if someone then became symptomatic, then got a test, then got that positive result, and their contacts were traced, that might take a bit of time. So by the time that contact's been traced, that contact's already become infectious and potentially gone on to infect someone else. So you're constantly playing catch-up with this kind of dynamic. And this was really a feature of COVID that made contact tracing very difficult. If you compare this to something like SARS, where a lot more transmission happened when people had symptoms, if COVID had had that kind of feature, it would push the timeline along. So we'd have something here where the infectious period is happening with symptoms, and you can see even if there's delay to contacts being traced, that contact is being identified before they're infectious and you're removing them from potential transmission. So that wasn't a time advantage we had with COVID. But there was some really nice innovation, a lot of it informed by modelling around things like apps to allow that automated contact tracing to happen much faster. But you also got some challenges in implementing targeted measures, particularly as epidemics grew. So some work we did, this is part of actually the RAMP initiative with the Royal Society, and using some high-resolution contact data we collected with the BBC. So this was with the University of Cambridge and others pre-pandemic. It was like high-resolution interactions between people in a particular town. What we found is if you try and do very effective contact tracing when you have very high levels of infection, you end up quarantining an awful lot of people. And you end up with measures that kind of act like a local lockdown because there's so much infection, and if people are behaving normally, such a high density of interactions, you really don't have to go far to find someone who becomes a contact of something. And sure enough, last year we saw this sort of so-called pingdemic, where there was relatively high levels of infection and large numbers of people got these exposure notifications. Now, the app was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing. It was letting people know that they were at risk of infection. But because there were so many infections out there, a lot of groups had a lot of these potential exposures. And I think, particularly in the media, some people hadn't really twigged that point until that happened. But it's something, again, when you think through the model, you don't even need to run the simulation. You just need to kind of think through the logistics of how these things work and different types of interactions you might have to see the sort of problems you might run into. So again, a model providing an insight which might not have been obvious and certainly wasn't to some people otherwise. But as we saw in a lot of populations, that contact tracing early on wasn't fast enough. Infections became unascertained, the epidemic started to grow, and a lot of populations had to turn to these broader, non-targeted measures instead. And again, models can be useful for informing that. And we'll hear more in the later talks about how that worked in the UK context. But just to give an idea broadly of how these things fit together. How do you model a population epidemic? Well, as we've already seen in some of these early models, you start off, you need some assumptions about the epidemiology, some epi parameters about what you think the disease biology, the timelines, the delays might be. We'll often incorporate social mixing data because, as you saw, different age groups mix together in different ways. And then we'll combine those together to have a model that can capture that corresponding transmission process. So like we saw the contact tracing, that timeline of infection and when those different transmission events happen. We'll then usually have a sort of secondary model that will convert those estimates of infections into things like severe disease, hospitalizations, deaths in different age groups. And then we can make scenarios for different situations. So this was some work that we did, most of it in sort of late Feb, early March 2020, and Imperial College did a lot of independent work in parallel that came to similar conclusions, that in the UK, given the severity profile of this infection, a lot of these lighter touch measures, such as just having some shielding of older groups or just having people self-isolate when they're ill, really wouldn't have been sufficient to avoid an overwhelming number of hospitalizations. And that's what we've seen around the world, some of the scenes that have come out of, say, Latin America and South Asia in subsequent waves of what can happen if this thing spreads uncontrolled. But as the epidemic develops, we're not just doing these things looking forward, because these were, again, done before the major waves occurred. What we can do is we can construct our model, as we did before, look at the past data, we can fit the model so we can essentially find the parameters that are consistent with what we've seen in past data, and then we can simulate forward these future scenarios. So a lot of these models have this really important step where they're making sure they're doing something consistent with past data before they're trying to produce that forward. And that's what we've seen in the UK and a lot of other countries, this process of developing and updating models as we go. But there's a bit of a challenge in communication, I think, often around when we talk about scenarios and what-if type questions. And one example was this is March 2020, this quote, or misquote rather, from Merkel saying, 67% of Germans are going to get infected. So it's going to happen. This will happen. So it's very much a kind of like weather forecasting approach of it's inevitable, that's what's going to happen. It was actually more of a scenario. So it was referring to if no action's taken and this thing just keeps going, you could see 70% infected. So it's quite an important conditional statement there on if no action is taken. And I think we're often used to dealing with forecast in the context of weather, where if you say it's going to rain, it's not going to change what the weather does. But if governments take action against pandemics, that's obviously going to change the dynamics of the infection, what subsequently happens. So I think it's really important, whenever we look at models, to ask, well, what's the model trying to answer? What's actually the question that people are interested in? I think what we've seen sometimes in the pandemic is models designed to answer one question have been interpreted by some people as trying to answer a different question, and then it creates this tension in interpretation. And so I think really, those of you who hear earlier, a very nice point made by Stephen Wiley about making sure that the model is coupled to the question it's trying to answer, because otherwise you get these kind of meaningless misinterpretations. But as we've seen the epidemic go on, it's not just about these first wave scenarios. We've also seen the emergence of variants that's added complexity. So these are a couple of news stories on the back of research that our group and others did. On the left is Alpha, and on the right is Delta. And one of the challenges during this period, again, going back to this problem of identifiability, when Alpha emerged, was it just because people were behaving a bit different in Kent? There was a lockdown, maybe adherence was different, age groups' behaviours were different. With Delta, was it just because there was an influx of travellers from India, a growing epidemic in India, growing infections? And again, in both these situations, models became a very useful way of bringing together these different data sources, social mixing data, traveller data, local data, genomics, to try and extract what was genuinely going on. And these headlines, we now know that these variants were more transmissible. They were spreading more easily. And models were really important backbone to be able to extract that kind of information from the available data. But unfortunately, it's becoming even harder to generalize as we get these waves of variants occurring. So just take you back to the start of this year, 1st of January 2022, this was the proportion fully vaccinated in Hong Kong and South Africa. So 2 doses of whatever the local schedule was. And we saw Omicron emerge, and we saw these kind of headlines from hospitals in South Africa that it seems to be milder, that compared to what they had in the Delta wave, cases weren't showing up with as severe symptoms. So if you look at this, you might conclude the world doesn't really have a problem. But then a couple of months later, Hong Kong's reporting astonishingly high death rates. And of course, those of you who've looked into a bit of this and familiar with the data know that vaccine coverage alone, these are different vaccines, different age groups. South Africa had large waves of the original variant, Beta, Delta. Hong Kong didn't have those waves. So what we're seeing in South Africa was against this background of exposures, which meant that vaccine coverage alone really didn't give us the full story. So it was very hard to take what happened in South Africa and assume it would be true for Hong Kong as well. And this is only going to get more difficult to take insights from one country to another, because at the start of the pandemic, we had this situation where if we wanted to understand the exposure history of a population, who'd had what, our question was broadly, has that person had COVID or not? Then as time went on, we started, well, the first sort of major change to people's exposure to the proteins in that virus was the vaccine campaign. So it wasn't just have they been infected, it's have they been vaccinated or not. Then in 2021 in particular, we saw the Delta variant where people who'd been vaccinated, their protection was different to people who'd had earlier variants. So there's this question of, well, have they had Delta as well after this vaccination? And then we started rolling out boosters, or at least the rich countries did, and we got, well, happy to had a booster and these other combinations of infection. And now we've got Omicron, and we've got BA1 and BA2, and now BA4 and BA5. And you can see every time we add in a different possibility, we double the number of combinations of possible exposures that individuals in that population might have had. So you just get this doubling in complexity and something where the point we're at now, actually just even writing down, not even a computer simulation, just writing down what's a sensible model becomes extremely difficult. And a lot of the work that we're doing, colleagues are doing at the moment is just trying to find ways of simplifying this down in a meaningful way. That we've got all of this complexity. Is there a way that, like this kind of Picasso type approach, we can strip back some of this complexity and still say something meaningful to countries that are thinking about future booster campaigns or what the immune structure of their population currently looks like? So again, the value of models just in thinking through what we're potentially dealing with. So I'll leave it there, I think, with kind of 4 main messages. First of all, that in real time, epidemic data are difficult to work with. This is true of any epidemic. They're delayed, they're biased, you're going to have things that are missing. So really, it's impossible to avoid modelling if we want to understand what's going on, the implications. Even in things like the ONS numbers that come out every week for community infections, that's not raw data. There's a model behind that that's helping to adjust for biases. And if you want to interpret those ONS numbers and trends, again, you're implicitly using a model. But we also need to bear in mind what question a model is trying to answer. We have a huge diversity of model applications, and often those models are designed for something very, very specific. So if we separate the model from the question, we can end up with a lot of misinterpretation and things that really aren't helpful for letting us deal with the pandemic. And a final point, I've talked a lot about epidemiology and transmission dynamics because that's my area of expertise, that's the area of expertise for my colleagues. But a lot of decisions have much wider reaching implications beyond just what it does for the epidemic dynamics. At several stages of the pandemic, I had journalists ask me questions like, what does the model say we should do? And my answer is, it can't tell us what to do. There's not a magic formula that can make your decisions for you. What they can do is they can help us understand the implications for the epidemic, though. And countries are going to have to keep making decisions against COVID. They're going to have to make decisions against the next pandemic. And what models can help us do is understand the underlying dynamics, help us know what we're dealing with, and inform better decisions about what we want to do about it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam, and really grateful that you reminded us of the journey that we've been on over the course of the pandemic and highlighted the complexity, the ever-increasing complexity of the situation. Can I just remind people that they can submit questions via Slido. The hashtag you need to use to access this meeting is hashtag M135. But without further ado, let's move on to our next presenter, Professor Chris Budd, who's going to talk about environmental factors in virus transmission. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So will it just appear? It says Louise Dyson in front of me at the moment. How are we doing at the back? Nope. Wrong talk. Try the one before that. I'll get there, I'm sure.
So again, whilst we're just waiting for the IT to be resolved, if we can please make sure that we are putting questions into Slido. We've got a few coming in now. I'd like to keep all of them to the end, and we can then have a proper panel discussion. Hopefully, you're receiving everything online. And again, if you're not able to receive anything, please do let us know. Hopefully now we should be able to access the right presentation.
More like it.
And there we go. We're ready to roll.
Right, well, good evening, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to speak at this fantastic meeting. So I'm going to talk about the environmental aspects of COVID transmission. So basically what happens between one person breathing out and another person breathing in. And there's all sorts of things that happen in the middle. And I should say my background, we've heard a lot about weather forecasting and compared that with COVID modelling. My background is in weather forecasting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how weather forecasting can actually be useful in COVID modelling. But I also want to say that most of what I'm going to say is really work done either by the wonderful people working with RAMP, and this is a RAMP workshop, and also by VCAMS, which is the Virtual Forum for Knowledge Exchange in Mathematical Sciences, who drafted me in to working in this area, and it's been quite a time. So one of the people I work with is the Science Media Centre. If you don't know them, get to know them. They're fantastic. And they contacted me one day and said that a reporter had been contacted by someone who'd been sitting in the park and a jogger had run past them, and should they be worried whether they had caught COVID or not from the jogger? So that's our starter for 10, so we can have a think about that. And I'll reveal the answer to that with a bit of mathematical modelling a little bit later on in the talk. So let's have a think about COVID and how we get from one person to another. So basically, we have a person with COVID who may or may not be wearing a mask, and they breathe out. They breathe out. So COVID comes out of their mouth in some way. And then there is a process of transmission. And there are various ways that transmission can occur. It can occur through aerosols, which are very small things, which have a long range and last for a while, or droplets like coughing, which are larger, which have a shorter range. This is the 2 meters. Or you can have transmission through fomites on surfaces, or you can have direct person-to-person transmission. And then the infected quanta then are breathed in or get onto someone's body somehow, and that leads to an infection for that person. So that is the process of COVID going through the environment. And there's all sorts of environmental things that we might want to consider. So when we breathe out, how do we breathe out? What's the nature of our breathing process? How actively do we breathe? What's the sort of load of virus that we're going to push out into the environment? And does it actually matter whether we wear a mask or not? So that's the exhalation bit. Then there's the transmission bit, which, where does COVID go? Well, it goes largely into the air. So there's a lot of issues there to do with ventilation and airflow. And this is where knowing a bit about weather forecasting can actually be kind of useful, well, I hope. Transmission depends upon the time it takes to get from one to the other, from the sorts of surfaces that you might contact on the way, and it depends very much on your location, whether you're inside, whether you're outside, whether you're in a poorly ventilated building or a well-ventilated building. And finally, inhalation. This is really not well understood because it's so dependent on the individual. It depends on how long you're in contact with someone, how far away you are from them, whether you yourself are wearing a mask, how much viral load you get, and how susceptible you are. So there are the kind of issues that we need to understand how likely we are to be able to catch COVID and what mechanisms we can put into place to minimise the risk on the way. Okay. So that's the environmental issues that we want to consider. I'm not going to talk at all about what goes on once you're inside the body or anything like that. I'm mostly interested in the bit in the middle in this talk. So just to sort of show you diagrammatically, here I'd call what are the 2.5 main transmission mechanisms. And I'll explain why it's a half in a minute. So basically there are 3 ways that the virus can get from one person to another. You can have the person coughing or spluttering or whatever and putting out droplets of infected material. And a droplet is kind of anything bigger than about 5 micron in diameter. So they're small, but not that small. But they're big enough to kind of be affected by gravity. They fall to the floor. They may evaporate on the way. And a typical droplet will basically end up about 2 meters or so away. And that's where the 2-meter rule comes from. It's a rule about droplets coming out through coughing, which may then get into your body or so on. Another mechanism, a rather more dangerous mechanism in my opinion, is aerosols, which are much smaller things. They're about less than 5 micron. This is what's coming out when you're breathing or speaking or whatever, and they get into the atmosphere, they hang around for a while, and they go a long way. And finally, there are fomites, which are the direct transmission of myself onto a surface, and in fact, in the RAMP team, I ended up partly on the fomite group, looking at the danger for that. So these are the various mechanisms that can be postulated for how COVID might get from one person to another. Well, let's have a look at some data. Well, obviously, we had tons of data towards the end of COVID, and there wasn't much at the beginning, but there was one very, very significant data point, and I owe this to Kath Noakes for bringing this to my attention, and that was the infamous choir practice at Skagit County in the USA. So what happened, this was in March 2020, so very much at the start of the pandemic, and in the Skagit County, 61 people rehearsed for 2.5 hours, and they were very careful. They had no physical contact, and they wiped their hands, and they cleaned all their surfaces and so on. And one choir member was, to quote them, mildly infected with COVID. As a result of that 2.5-hour choir practice with 60 people, who, of course, by definition, were singing, and we'll see why that's a bad thing in a minute, 53 people went on to get COVID, 3 ended up in hospital, and 2 died. Okay, so that was a massive, massive thing. Very, very sad, of course. And it was a combination of 3 really bad things all in one go. It was quite a lot of people in a poorly ventilated building. Choir practices are usually elderly people, so they're more susceptible, and they were singing. Okay, that's about as bad as you can get. But from a positive side of things, it gave us a strong clue that the primary mechanism for COVID transmission was probably airborne. And that's important. So rather than surface contamination because they'd all cleaned themselves, or short distance because they'd been quite careful, it seemed from that the primary mechanism was long-range airborne. And that was a really, really important hint and gave us a lot of idea how we should then go on to model and then hopefully control what was going on. And that choir practice made it onto a poster, which is unusual for a choir practice. So this is a poster issued by the American government. There on the top left is the one person that was infected at the start. 87% of that choir ended up getting COVID. And as I said, 2 people died. And you can see this is an American poster because you have to stay 6 feet apart rather than 2 meters apart. There's a very powerful message that came from that one incident in Skagit County. Very sad, but obviously important that it helped save lives later on. Right, so now we've kind of established the fact that airborne is probably the main mechanism. Let's have a look at the issues which involve that. And first, of course, is exhalation. So basically what happens when you breathe, okay? And when you breathe out hot air. It's called a heated Gaussian plume, and a typical breath might last about 4 seconds, and the stuff comes out at about 6 meters per second. And here's some lovely pictures which are due to the Cambridge group, Agathe and Linden et al. In 2021. These are Schlieren images of a person doing 3 types of activity: breathing, speaking, and laughing. And you can see the plume coming out of their mouths. This is this hot air. And laughing is clearly the worst mechanism you can have in terms of firing out. Well, it's not quite the worst. As I said, singing is the worst. There we go. This is the particle number concentration, which is the vertical axis. On the right, we have the horizontal axis, which is essentially different types of activity. So if you speak happy birthday, you have fairly low particle number concentration. But if you sing it, it goes up by an order of magnitude. And if you cough, it goes out even more. So you can see the amount that you put into the atmosphere really does depend quite a lot on the activity that you do. And singing is particularly bad. And I actually did a workshop with the Church of England on how we could reduce COVID in carol services, because they're quite worried about those. If you have a mask, things are much better. So again, these are Schlieren pictures taken by the Cambridge group. This is the same with a mask. And the plume that comes out is significantly reduced. Now, masks had all sorts of bad press when they came out, and there was this issue whether you should wear a mask, whether you wear a shield, and so on. these pictures do show very much that having a mask does significantly reduce not so much the content of what you breathe out, because that's got to go somewhere, but very much the momentum of what goes out. And we'll see in a second why that's important when you combine it with ventilation. Okay. So that's the exhalation process. There are loads of uncertainties here because different people breathe in different ways and different people all breathe out infected material in different ways. But still, the basic point is clear that wearing a mask cuts it down, and breathing is way, way less than laughing, and certainly much less than singing. Okay. So the level at which you push out, of course, also depends very much on time. We saw essentially this picture in the last talk, where your level of infection significantly increases over the couple of days after you catch the disease, and then decreases afterwards. So that obviously also goes in to the issues when you worry about people breathing out. And we'll see how that comes into our modelling later on. Okay, so that's the first stage in the process, the breathing out. Okay, the next bit is what happens in the middle, and this is where the virus typically gets into the air and starts to move around. And here, ventilation really does make a very big difference for how the virus will get from the person on the right into the person that's going to inhale it. Okay. So I'm assuming here that we're being all good people and socially distancing each other so that the droplets are not going to hit us directly. I'm worried here much more about the aerosols in the environment, in the air. So basically what happens is that when you breathe out hot air, and the hot air rises and will go from the bottom of the room to the top. And we saw some talks about that earlier today, again by people from the Cambridge group. And here's one of their pictures where we get sort of an entrained plume moving upwards, plus this is someone without a mask, so we also get the momentum coming out in the kind of browner thing. When you breathe out carbon dioxide, and actually that's useful because you can use carbon dioxide then as a proxy for how much infection there might be in a room, and carbon dioxide monitors have been installed in places like schools to help understand and monitor what might be the risk. But there's a very, very simple rule here, and it's a rule which is not new. It's a rule which goes way back to Florence Nightingale, who incidentally her statue is just outside. You can go and see Florence Nightingale, her statue on the street just outside the Royal Society. It says she's a nurse. In fact, she was a really good mathematician as well. But anyway, one thing she said was that if you want to keep safe in a hospital, have high ceilings and open the windows. And that's a good rule with COVID as well as anything else. Why is it a good rule? Because if you have normal ventilation, which kind of just mixes the air around, all that does is kind of circulate the virus from one person to another, which isn't kind of what you want. But if you have high ceilings and what's called displacement ventilation, so that the ventilation takes the hot air at the top and shoves it out through a hole, then that's much more effective at removing the COVID virus because hot air rises and people breathe out hot air. So these again pictures from Bhagat et al., the Cambridge group, showing on the right the effect of displacement ventilation on someone that's not wearing a mask. On the bottom left, displacement ventilation on someone that is wearing a mask, where you take it out at the top, and on the right, the effect of opening the window. So ventilation really is important, but it has to be the right sort. And here, so I apologise, it's a somewhat busy slide, but here's some quotes from Paul Linden, who is one of the key members of the RAMP team. So mixing ventilation is intended to keep everything airborne, but it's essentially not a good idea. Better strategies you should have, in particular displacement ventilation, where you extract air near the ceiling. But Paul brings in the caveat that 5 feet? Oh gosh, would have more than that. Yeah, that people moving around can actually cause a lot more problems of their own, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, so airflow is very important. One of the problems, though, is it's actually very hard to calculate the precise airflow in a room because it can be very, very complicated and moving around, and you have to do this using sophisticated computational fluid dynamics methods. So Kath Noakes and her group with TRAC have done a lot of work with that, but a somewhat simpler way of working out what's going on is to look at the average airflow. So you can, in a room, measure things like the kind of average flux of air, how many air changes per hour you have, this thing called Q, which is relatively easy to measure. So if you look at the average amount of air flow through a room in an hour, that actually gives you a lot of information about how likely people are to get an infection. Now, I know it's nearly 8:30 in the evening, and it's been a long day, but here comes our first big mathematical formula. So brace yourselves, but it's a good one. This is the wonderful Wells-Riley model for infection. This is so good that I set it to my master students as a project for this year. So this is a wonderful thing. This is a model which expresses how likely you are to be infected in a time t. So I'll unpack this. Pi is your chance of being infected. X is the exponential function. I is the number of people in the room that are infected. P is how much they breathe out. T is how long you are exposed. Q is how many quanta of infected stuff they breathe out in a certain time. And big Q is the room ventilation rate. This is the Wells-Riley model, which is the bedrock of a lot of our studies about how likely people are to be infected by COVID in a certain time. And one of the key things about this is that the longer you are in a room, the more likely you are to be infected, but the bigger the ventilation rate, big Q, the less likely you are to be infected. So let's have a look at how this works out. So one of the projects I was involved with was looking at safety on a train, COVID safety on a train. And what we did in this was we looked at typical ventilation rate, which is about 6,000 litres per minute on a train. People breathe out at about 15 litres per minute. We estimated maybe you have 2 infected people on a train carriage, and the amount of infected stuff they breathe out is between 0.1 and 10 quanta per minute. I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are predictions from the Wells-Riley model. On the left, the red curve shows the number of people infected in, say, 90 minutes, which is a typical journey time from, in my case, Bath to Bristol. No, that's a bit of a lie. But imagine you're on a train for an hour and a half, and the quanta rate is 0.5, which is red. If you have 2 people infected on that, with that ventilation rate, at the end of the journey, you have 20 people infected. This is quite worrying. Quite worrying. On the right, you can see the effect of the flow rate. The faster the flow rate, it dramatically reduces the likelihood of being infected because it gets rid of the infectious material so quickly. And these graphs helped us advise the trained people. And here on coming out of this, little q here is the quanta. This is the amount of infected material you're pushing out from your mouth in a minute. And what's very significant about this graph is that the percentage of people infected in a certain time, this is in a minute, with that infection rate, really dramatically increases with Q. And that's why wearing a mask is so important. And on the right are various pictures of how Q is significantly cut down by wearing a mask. So this is all coming out of the model. Now, unfortunately, the Wells-Riley model just describes how likely people are to be infected if they're sitting on a train. But when you sit on a train, actually that's the safe bit. You're rather more... Oh, sorry, yes. Everyone agrees that singing on a train... Don't sing on a train. Okay. Very bad to sing on a train. One of the problems with getting a train is that you have to crowd and hustle in with people to get on. And this person-to-person interaction is actually a source of infection. And we did some modelling work on this, and the modelling work assumed that a train drove up at a station with various doors. People come onto the platform and try to get onto the train. And this is a model which doesn't run on this machine. Oh dear. Problem from one going from one system to another. Anyway, you can model how people interact, and you can see a picture. The red people are the infected and the black are the clear. As people move around, they start to move closer to each other, and social distancing sort of goes out of the window. You get close person-to-person transmission and viral load. And Kath Noakes, studying trains, said close range carries the most virus. And one of the problems when people interact is even if you don't want to get close to people, there are situations when you can't avoid getting close to people. And many of those situations are things which are natural things that you might do in your life, like getting onto a train. So you can model this, and one way to model it is to consider two possibilities. In this picture, the person in the middle is a susceptible person that might catch the virus. Person on the right is someone that has the virus and is a distance capital D away from them. And the person above is our famous jogger, the person that we talked about at the beginning, who's going to be running past our our susceptible person at a distance delta D. And one of the things that you try to understand is how likely that person in the middle is going to get infected, either by someone going past them quickly at a distance delta D, or staying close to them at a distance capital D for a long time. And you can actually model that situation. The key thing is to look at the kind of way that droplets disperse from one person to another. This is a function f of r, which is variously modelled as 1 over r squared or 1 over r cubed, depending upon the type of geometry that you have. And here is a series of graphs that we put together for various models. The top right is 1 over r squared, and the bottom left is 1 over r cubed. And these are different curves for different distances d. You have the walk-by distance of someone running and the time. And what's really interesting, and comes out very clearly from this modelling, is that it is much safer to be passed close to by someone if they are walking at a reasonable speed than to spend a certain time maybe further away from someone who is stationary. And that came out very, very clearly from the modelling that we did. And the clear conclusion that is always avoid queues. Queues are an absolute disaster when it comes to spreading COVID, and we did a load of modelling work with a number of people, the rugby people and even Edinburgh Fringe, working out ways to minimise queues. So I shall do one quick case study and then I shall shut up. But it's a nice case study because it involves all of us. What is one activity that we all have to do, even during lockdown and even if we're ill? Eat. Okay? We all have to eat. So I want to quickly talk about COVID and retail. And this was a VCAMS modelling project. So as I say, we all need to go shopping. And what you do in shopping is you involve a lot of short interactions with an open group. These are people you don't know, combined with queuing and significant behavioural uncertainty. So we all need to go shopping. We can't avoid it, even if we want to. And it involves meeting people that we wouldn't otherwise meet. Okay. So various issues in a shop. You typically move around looking at things to eat or buy, and you also have to queue at the end. And it's important when you organise a shop to work out what the safest way to organise that shop is so that people don't get infected. And this is something that you can address using the various bits of information that we've built up, using our understanding about how COVID is transmitted in the environment. So here's a typical shop, essentially what happens is you move around in the shop either under your own free will or obeying instructions from the shop person. You queue at the end and you can infect someone by short-range droplets or long-range aerosols, and susceptible people get exposed to the virus. If you want to model a shop, well, the most important thing is to model the shoppers, and you can do this using a thing called an agent-based model, where the agent-based model models different people individually and tracks their progress. Each person is then assumed to be either infected or not infected, and they breathe out. And we have the droplet model, where we have an inverse square law here. F of R is 1 over R squared, plus the Wells-Riley model for aerosol contamination. That movie worked. That's interesting. So there's a movie of various shoppers moving around. You may not be able to tell from here, but each shopper has psychologically built into them different types so you can either be a shopper like me that goes from one thing to another and out with a shopping list, or someone that wanders around and does stuff which they like. So here are different shoppers being modelled. The key thing about this is that you can calculate with the shopping models the sort of viral exposure. And we modelled two things. One where the shop had a queue, so you all walked around very carefully and followed everyone and followed signs. And what we found with that was that the problem with that was that you were spending too long close to people, and if people stayed socially distant, that was all right, but if you disrespected distance, then you'd actually end up infecting a lot of people, so that was a bad thing. However, if you had a shop where people just allowed to mill around randomly, and you cut the queues down to a minimum by having machines and stuff, then that massively reduced the exposure. So our advice to the shops, and we actually work with Sainsbury's in this, was get rid of your signs and let people just zip around as quickly as you can. So conclusions: random shopping is safer than guided shopping. Avoid queues at all points in shops, trains and large events. And I shall just say overall, so the overall conclusion is that the primary transmission mechanism for COVID through the environment is droplets and aerosols. Florence Nightingale got it right. Let's have tall rooms with good ventilation. Avoid queues in all times. Do not sing in public places. And mathematical modelling is great, but it's only part of the answer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Really clear and illustrating again the additional complexity when you start to think about some of the other factors that we have to consider when modelling. But at least, singing in a queue is something that we should absolutely discourage. Okay, our final presentation is from Dr. Louise Dyson from the University of Warwick, who's going to talk to us about how the information that we've heard about gets translated from the scientists into the policymakers. Good luck, Louise. A really interesting topic. Thank you.
I'm hoping I won't need too much luck, but thank you anyway. Yes, so my challenge was to talk about the path that you would take, all this scientific knowledge that we have been talking about all day, but particularly in these last two talks, how we go from science to policy. And this is very much a personal view, and one of the things I have learned is that your point of view in the process really changes how you look at things quite a lot, actually. So this is how the UK sort of pathway looked during the pandemic. So we have the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, sort of in the middle here. And in brackets, I've put the number of participants as listed on the government website. So 151 participants of SAGE. If you actually go and look at the minutes of each SAGE meeting, you'll find that there are not 151 people in every meeting. These are, to be on that list, you had to go to at least one SAGE meeting. So SAGE here I'm talking about is the one for COVID. So in fact, if SAGE is a thing that exists for different sorts of emergencies, and the makeup of SAGE will be different depending on the particular type of emergency. For COVID, there were, I think, 105 meetings in total, so it was a pretty long emergency over around 2 years. So it developed this kind of structure to kind of deal with that a little bit. So I've put some of the subgroups of SAGE here. There are others that exist as well. So we have the environmental modelling group who are doing things like Chris was just talking about, looking at how the virus transmits in places. We have SPI-M, which is the modelling subgroup who are thinking about how virus is transmitted between people and at population level, so like Adam was talking about. We have the behavioural science subgroup, SPI-B, which we haven't talked about at all. And there are also other sorts of groups. Some of them, so there are also other groups that are advising policy but maybe aren't quite part of this pathway, for example. And I have highlighted a little person, that's me, so I was in SPI-M, which is this sort of modelling subgroup. So what did SPI-M do? SPI-M provided really rapid responses to commissions. So essentially, people would come to us and ask questions, and we would try and provide them with modelling support to have some kind of evidence towards answering those questions. And when I say rapid, at the beginning, when I joined in March 2020, SPI-M meetings were generally on a Monday morning. We would get an email on a Friday evening, maybe 6 p.m., maybe 10 p.m., with the question you had to answer by Monday morning. So you've got to do all your work over the weekend, so write everything up and send it in to SPI-M. And SPI-M has these multiple independent groups. I think it's a real kind of plus point of SPI-M. It's you have different groups who are all studying the same sort of questions. So we've all got that same email that is the commission for this week, and we're all trying to come up with an answer. And that is somewhat a mitigation of these really quick turnarounds. So to start with, it was really just the weekend. In, I think, May 2020, the SPI-M meetings moved to a Wednesday, which was great. So we would still get asked things on a Friday, but we had 2 extra days, which was really important. And we'd have these sort of multiple groups all kind of feeding in, and it provided what I would call a kind of rapid peer review. So even though these pieces of evidence are generally not being peer reviewed in a kind of traditional manner, they're not being published in a peer reviewed journal before it's going up to SAGE in those 2 days at the weekend, still you are presenting your work to other people who have been studying the same things, and you're having a really frank, open discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of what you've done, and you're comparing the outputs from different groups. So if 2 or 3 or 4 groups are basically coming back with the same qualitative answer, you feel pretty secure in the advice that you're giving. And if they're giving different answers, you can ask why. What was it about the assumptions that Group 1 made that was different to Group 2? Or is there a mistake in there somewhere? So the other thing that SPI-M produces as a result of all of these things is consensus statements. So the Secretariat of SPI-M write up all of the stuff that we've been talking about into a nice, neat little package that says, this is what the group thinks. And consensus doesn't mean 100% agreement. You can definitely have two different viewpoints in there, and the consensus statement can say, we are uncertain. And that uncertainty is really important to be communicated forward. Now, the way I've described it makes it sound a bit like we get asked questions and we answer those questions and that's it, and that's not the case at all. So SPI-M also provided, and SAGE, provided a route for kind of non-commissioned insights. So if you thought, oh, well, you asked me this question, but I think this adjacent thing is much more important, this is something I can do. Or if you had some piece of analysis that you had done recently that you thought was super important and somebody should be looking at, SPI-M provides a kind of conduit for all of those things. And we were supported by an incredible secretariat. So these are civil servants who are working to support SPI-M. So they're organising the meetings, but they're doing much more than that. They are a conduit to policymakers and into government. So when we're getting those commissions, these are people who are ensuring that the questions we're being asked are things that the modelling can sensibly contribute to. And when we have provided responses, they are ensuring sensible communication of those results back again. So you can look on the government website, there are all the kind of outputs of SAGE, but it's important to bear in mind that these things come with, essentially, some people to explain them. So we're not really just sending a document off into the ether and hoping that everything will be fine. The other thing that we got through SPI-M, which was super important and has been mentioned a number of times during the day, was data. Without data, we are nothing. There is no point in modelling if you have no data. And data came through originally Public Health England, which is now part of UK HSA, and was sort of transmitted by DSTL. And the whole process has been a massive team effort. So just looking at those numbers of participants in brackets, that's quite a few people to start with. But behind each of those people, there is likely to be a group, bigger or smaller, to whom you are going. So if I get a commission on a Friday evening, I'm going back to my group and I'm saying, okay, this is what they've asked us for. Do we have things that we could be using? Do we have, what can we do for this commission? And so, there are groups in our institutions who are kind of supporting all of this work, and those are generally postdocs. So people on fixed-term contracts, you've maybe got a job for 2 or 3 years, who are doing an awful lot of the actual day-to-day work that is going into this response. And we've heard from lots of these people today already, and they are sort of the unsung heroes of this whole process. And then behind them, we also have a massive scientific community. So people who are maybe infectious disease modelers like myself, but not on SPI-M, but also people who are in adjacent or very separate subjects. And RAMP was really instrumental in making sure that so at the beginning we had a lot of offers of help from people, which was really great, but also very difficult to deal with, because when you're sort of doing everything, you're working evenings and weekends already, trying to organise a response is really hard. And I think RAMP played a really important role in making sure that worked. So then there are lots of different routes into policy, and I've put some here that I know about, and I'm sure there are many more too. So the most obvious route is the two co-chairs of SAGE, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance. But there's also the secretariats, so the secretariat of SPI-M, but there are also secretariats of SAGE and the other groups. So these are the civil servants who are kind of translating all of this insight. And then each meeting also has observers. So there will be people who will, I was going to say come to the meeting, but of course it's all online, will be at these meetings. So from lots of different bodies, from UKHSA, also many participants are also affiliated to UKHSA directly. Observers from the Cabinet Office, from Treasury, from Number 10, from the devolved administration, so Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so these people are watching the discussion, sometimes participating a little bit, but they're seeing the full product, not just the written document at the end, but our discussion, and they're getting a kind of an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of everything that is going on. So this is the kind of feeding into policy part of the diagram, which I've just drawn part of, and I've put myself in the Cabinet Office as well because I had a short-term secondment to the Cabinet Office COVID-19 task force. So that's the sort of the other point of view that I've had during this. So I was asked to talk about the path from science to policy. And I think sometimes it's not even clear exactly where science becomes policy. And as advisors, we would like to draw that line very distinctly. Many people were talking about this earlier on, that as advisors, we do science, we do not do policy. But I think there is a little bit of a blurring of the line, and it's important to kind of just be aware of that. So there are parts of this process that are very clearly science. There are parts of the process that are very clearly policy, thinking about how exactly we're going to implement different things. But in some sense, we are also being asked specific questions, and those questions are related to policy, and you are developing your model to inform those questions. So in that sense, I think the policy does start to inform the science, and the more that policymakers hear about science and hear about modelling, I think it starts to affect the way that they think too. I think in a good way. I hope they think in a good way too. Okay, so I just wanted to take a sort of example of a sort of stream of work that I was involved with. So this was daily contact testing. So in January 2021, the schools were going back. We'd had the kind of alpha wave, and we had a lot of these lateral flow tests. So the tests that you take, it takes about half an hour. You just do it at home. And the question was, what are we going to do with all of these tests? Before Christmas, the schools had this kind of bubbling policy. So pupils were kind of segregated into different bubbles, and the idea was that if somebody tests positive in your bubble, everybody else has to go home. And that's a great way of keeping COVID under control, but it also means that a lot of kids end up being sent home. So there was a thought that maybe we could do instead what I'm going to call daily contact testing, where instead of sending everybody home, you say, okay, well, every morning you have to take a lateral flow test, and you can only come in if your lateral flow test is negative. This work was done by Tristan Leng, who is a postdoc. So as I say, the postdocs do lots of the work. So the first thing that we submitted to SPI-M was at the end of January. It was a very kind of early work, and we were modelling infections in bubbles in schools. And the thing that we were thinking about was the difference between PCR tests, where you would send your test away to a laboratory and get an answer back in a couple of days, versus these lateral flow tests. You get the answer pretty much straight away. And there were lots of arguments about whether the lateral flow test was a good enough test to be using for these purposes. Because if you test people who are infected, you will sometimes get people who are positive on a PCR test and negative on a lateral flow test. They're less sensitive. And that is true. But there's an important point to make here, which is that it depends on how long you've been infected for. And that's these two graphs here. So we can just look at the top line on each graph. But you can see that so the x-axis is the days since infection, and the y-axis is your probability of testing positive. So you get infected, your virus multiplies and multiplies inside you, you get lots of virus, that means you're more likely to test positive. Eventually your immune system kicks in and you clear the infection and you get less and less likely to test positive. And you can see that the PCR test returns to zero much slower than the lateral flow test. But at peak infection, you're still very likely to test positive on a lateral flow. And that's the great thing about lateral flows. It sort of concentrates your positivity around the point where you have most virus. So, as I said, this is very early work. We didn't have a lot of the parameterization, so we did lots of sensitivity analysis where we were changing parameters and checking how much that mattered. But this is the graph we came up with. So it's a slightly complicated graph, but on the x-axis we have the total number of kids that are infected by the end of term. On the y-axis we have the number of school days that are being missed. So ideally you would like to be in the bottom left corner. And then we've got the two different strategies. Either when someone tests positive in your bubble, you send everyone home. That's isolation. It's the red dots, and it's the sort of big mass. And each dot here is a different realization. So it's giving an idea of the uncertainty in the result. And at the bottom there are the blue dots, which is what happens if you do this kind of daily contact testing. So you can see that it massively reduces the number of school days that the kids miss at the expense of you're a little bit more likely to get infected. So this was very early work. We later did this again, so we kind of developed it over time, and this is the figure in the actual published paper. The two colours are the same, but there are extra dots in here too, so the red is still the same things. And you can see that we still get the same qualitative results. So even though these were very early results, it actually sort of held together pretty well. And I think one thing that this graph makes clear is that the counterfactuals are important. So at that time we were comparing between what happens if you send everyone home versus you test them. And then you get a little bit more infection. But say if we were going to implement that now, we would be comparing between not doing anything and testing people. So you would get less infection. So it depends what it is, the other thing that you're thinking about, as to whether you're going to get more infection or less infection, more days missed or less days missed. So that was the kind of the early work that we did, and then this work kind of developed over time. So that early work didn't particularly seem to influence all that much, but in late February, early March, we started having meetings with Test and Trace, which were organised through SPI-M, which was thinking about daily contact testing in a wider sense. So there were other groups involved. We were thinking in schools, other groups were thinking in other settings. And we got SPI-M Commission asking about this, and there's a consensus statement. And we kind of added on extra kind of results here. So we were thinking about adherence. So how many people were actually going to take the tests and what effect does that have? So these are the two graphs that you can see the effect. The colours are the same again, but I won't go through them. So a nice thing was that there was actually then a trial that got held. The trials began in schools. There was a bit of disagreement about whether this was an okay thing to do or not. So there was a BMJ opinion piece that said it's unethical, we definitely shouldn't be doing it. And then the authors of the trial replied and said, well, we think it is ethical. Obviously, that's why we're doing it. And both sides cited our consensus statement, which is always nice. So the trials did continue, and they published a Lancet paper, and they found roughly what we were saying, that daily contact testing didn't significantly increase infections. On the other hand, there weren't that many infections around anyway, and that meant that there were also not large reductions in school absences. And that's kind of the end of the story, because we never actually implemented this in schools in the end. Eventually, they did implement daily contact testing at a wider scale, but schools never did. In September, they stopped bubbling, and in April this year, of course, there is no more routine testing, really. We published 2 papers, so if you're interested, there are the papers. And I just want to finish by thinking about this system. So we have this kind of route through SAGE. At times, from my perspective, it felt like a big funnel. You kind of push things upwards and you hope that something happens and you're not quite sure if anything does. But there are kind of inherent tensions in this system. So if we're thinking about how we could do things better, I think it's important to be aware of the balance that the system is trying to make. And I think a lot of these things got better over time during the pandemic. And I think it's important to think about those things. So here are 4 inherent tensions in the system. The first is these really short deadlines. And that is quite challenging for us as scientists, because we never really want to put something out into the public domain. Certainly we don't want to advise policymakers on the basis of something that we're not confident in. But the decision is being made. Doing nothing is a decision too. And it's reasonable and good for the policymakers to have all the information they can. So I think there are various types of people that found these short deadlines really difficult because they didn't have the time to do all the careful checking that they would have liked to have done. I also found that difficult, but I think one does have to work in the system. And we try and introduce mitigations to make that as good as it can be, like having different groups in SPI-AM. And I think it's really important that we continue to have different independent groups available to do that sort of work. And there is a temptation to maybe funnel all the funding into one big group, and I think that's a mistake, though perhaps I am biased. The second thing is data, which lots of people think about and is always a challenge. So the tension between it's a pandemic, it's an emergency, we need the information now, and it's for the good of everybody to have that information, versus people have a right to privacy, and as soon as you have published anything, it is out there and there's no going back. So it's important to be careful. There was an initiative through Ben Goldacre, which is the Open Safely initiative, which is really interesting, using NHS data in a really careful way so that you can interrogate individuals' data without knowing individuals' data, if you see what I mean. The third thing I'm most interested in, maybe, is thinking about open science versus the information control that is desired within government. So at times it has felt, sitting in a particular place in this route that I could only see what was around me. I knew what SPI-M was doing. Maybe I a little bit knew what SAGE was doing, but anything further up was really hard to know. And actually anything to the sides was quite hard to know. So knowing what was happening in the environmental modelling group or in SPI-B was quite challenging. And part of that was just, it was super fast and it was hard to keep attention on everything. But I think there is this tension between we as scientists really want to give the best answer that we can. I am very happy to be told things, and well, not happy, but if I'm told policy implications, then I will keep them secret if I need to, so long as I can do the best work I can. Versus, you know, if you're a politician, you don't really want to tell a large group of scientists who can in principle say whatever they like what your potential policies are that you're considering. That is clearly difficult. But I would also, as a scientist, you know, I do my best work if I have all the information, and I would also like to be able to tell everybody. I would like to be able to go to my colleagues and say, well, they asked me this, but I'm not quite sure how. I thought you had something similar. Can we have a conversation? And then the fourth thing, which is maybe less modelling and more just sort of science communication, I think there is this kind of tension between the public having right to know what's going on. You know, if there's a new variant that looks a bit dodgy, then the public have a right to know that something is happening. But inevitably, if you tell people things early, it is less likely to be 100% accurate. And so trying to balance giving clear and accurate information with telling people in a timely way, I think is quite difficult. And people have learnt a lot during the pandemic, I think, about how science works, maybe more than some people would have liked to have learnt. And maybe some people got to see how the sausages were made in multiple different ways. That it's always interesting. So I said it was a team effort, and it really, really is. So on the left here, there is the Warwick team, which is lots of people. There's a bit of an overlap, so I haven't put the pictures in twice. On the right, I can't do lefts and rights, there is the Juniper Consortium, which I'm a member of. And this was a group of different people from different institutions. We all kind of met through SPI-M. And I think this is an example of where you can kind of bring together lots of people from different places. And the pandemic has made that a lot easier to kind of collaborate with people who are not, you know, just down the corridor from you. So if you're interested in knowing more, there are two links at the bottom there. One is to the Warwick COVID team, which has got lots of papers and interesting bits, and the other is to the Juniper Modelling Consortium. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Louise. And if I could invite Adam and Chris back onto the stage. I'm very pleased to say that we've got a great set of questions that I can start asking our panellists their views about. I'll let them get some water first, because it is going to be a very detailed session now. There's some pretty challenging questions coming through. What I'm going to do is I'll group some of them together for the sake of time, and I'll also ask some questions just to individual panellists and some to the whole panel. And in that vein, what I'd like to do is ask the whole panel a question from the audience, which is, what do you think is the main way in which modelling needs to improve before the next pandemic? I'll start with Adam.
Okay. So, I mean, maybe to reflect on one of the ways that I think modelling improved a lot during this pandemic was, I think at the start, a lot of these tools were being developed mostly from scratch or adapting quite rudimentary, but rough, code bases that weren't properly documented, things that weren't very flexible, things that were kind of built hard into code and not very adaptable to new situations. And I mean, for example, as variants came out, the questions became much clearer. The questions we had for Alpha, similar questions came up for Delta, similar questions came up for Omicron, and those models were in much better shape. And I think even now, a lot of us could write a list of these are going to be the questions in the next epidemic. Do we have models that are ready to go and flexible? And I think in some of those cases, the answer is still no, and that's something that I think would be be an obvious starting point to fix.
And the point that you made about the increasing complexity over the lifetime of the pandemic, do you think we understand how to think about that when it comes to the future world of modelling?
I think that's going to be a big challenge, certainly for COVID, but for other infections. We know for flu, we see this pandemic to this kind of an epidemic changing shift. I think alongside that, I'd also add not just developing more complex models, but also thinking about data requirements and having those discussions about can you design data sets that are going to help address some of the uncertainties in your model, given what we know about some of these other infections.
Thanks, Adam. Chris, comes to you next.
So one thing I've really enjoyed doing during the pandemic is being part of big modelling teams, say bringing lots of expertise together, focusing it on problems, but bringing ideas from left, right and centre. I think I'd like to see the teams actually getting bigger in the sense that we've concentrated very much on certain aspects of COVID modelling, such as the epidemiology or the environmental side, but we've got to bring in the psychology, we've got to bring in the economics, we've got to try to model how our policymakers are going to react. So all of this needs to be brought in. We can't just do COVID modelling in isolation. So that means working with an even more interesting group of people, which I really would value.
I think that's a really interesting point that's come out through the course of the day, isn't it? That interdisciplinarity has delivered some innovation when it comes to the approaches that we've taken. And I think thinking through how that can be maintained and sustained against the normal ways of working is going to be a real challenge for all of us, actually. Louise.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that our field is going to change a lot and has already changed a lot. The sheer wealth of data that we have for COVID is incredible. And particularly in the UK, the COVID dashboard is a really great resource and has been a great resource for the public and for scientists, and I think will continue to be. And I suppose I would add to Chris's list behaviour, that I think, so the behaviour of people is a difficult thing to model, but is definitely something that we have got much more data to work with now. And so I hope that we will make good use of that.
Excellent. Really, really important point. Okay, let me try and pick up some individual questions. There's a bit of a theme around quality assurance, things around the worst model, the best model. So perhaps, Adam, you could pick up that whole theme of how you think the quality assurance process worked to make sure that the models had been through a rigorous assurance process.
Yeah, so I think Louise obviously gave a very nice overview of the SPI-M process, which for those of us who've sat in a meeting feels like very intense scrutiny sometimes on our work. Within our group at London School, we also implemented a rapid internal review process. You had people who'd lead on the work, and then you had people who weren't closely involved review it within usually 24 hours, particularly if we put anything online, because during those peak parts, even a rough report put online, journalists will jump on. It might get a lot of traction, obviously, going through SPI-M on policymakers. So although it wasn't as robust as you might have for a formal academic paper, putting those kind of checks in place. And I think for the models that were being used regularly, where we could going and revisiting things that perhaps for a new variant we'd have to do very quickly, tidying it up, making sure that any of those kind of wrinkles were ironed out. I think those, as Louise mentioned, some of the things that would be potential for future work is more of that understanding of behaviour. And I think one of the things, particularly in real time, it's very hard to do is you're, to some extent, just trying to stay afloat with the volume of questions that are coming in, and you're tightening up anything on models, which is obviously a bit of an issue. But actually some of those deeper questions about scientific understanding of actually, what are the human behavioural responses? What is the complexity around immune responses? we don't necessarily dig into as much as we can. So I think over the coming years, we'll probably get a much deeper understanding of some of these questions that weren't really possible in real time.
Thanks, Adam. And perhaps if I can turn the question round, Louise, and ask you whether you thought there was a good process that ensured that the questions that were being asked of the modellers were properly quality assured, because of course if you've got the wrong exam question you're not necessarily going to give the right answer. So what do you think needs to be done to improve the asking of the question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that improved a lot over the course of the pandemic. So the Secretariat were really instrumental in this, but they were also, I think there was a lot of learning of science that policymakers were doing, and they were doing it on the fly, but they were really kind of improving over time. So there was at one point a kind of almost a toy model that was available to policymakers. It wasn't really modelling COVID, but it was something that they could kind of play with and understand how epidemics work. And how modelling works as well. And I think that the kind of questions that we were getting got a lot better the more that people understood what modelling could do or what modelling couldn't do. So I suppose for the future it would be really nice if maybe if you were going to be an MP that you had a little bit of training in modelling or in science as part of the process.
Really, really good point. Let's hope people are listening and will do something about it. I mean, I think one of the things that I've observed is we've had a lot more Whitehall teach-ins, as they're called. So as things have developed, the need for training for policymakers has been delivered through those rapid sort of approaches, which I think has been really helpful. Let's move on to a couple of specific questions. And Chris, this one's for you, I think, and it's about aerosols. And the question is, how quickly do aerosols spread?
Well, that's a very, very good question. So once they're in the atmosphere, they basically spread around with the air. So that's why ventilation is so important. So the ventilation will carry the aerosol out of the system. They don't particularly move on their own. They haven't got much momentum. So they're suspended in the air. They move with the air. So if the air is still, they don't move very much. And this is why going outside is so much safer than being inside. So I never answered the question. The jogger, by the way, if they run past you, you're pretty safe because they're running fast and taking all their plume with them. And natural air currents in the outside will carry the aerosols away because the wind speed's several meters per second. It's much more dangerous in a interior environment where the air isn't moving around so much, where the aerosols are not moving.
And just to develop that, there are a few questions about, again, some specific issues, but are there any specific risk factors that affect that sort of aerosol movement issue that you've just described? So one of the questions, for example, about lower ceilings, are there other risk factors that you think we need to consider?
Very hard to answer that question because it depends so much upon the geometry of the room. So if you get air trapped in parts of the room, then that's going to be risky. The safest thing is to have, say, good airflow high up to move the hot air, which contains the aerosols, away as fast as possible. But if you get sort of trapped areas of air where it's getting recirculated, and you can get that even with good ventilation, that's what you've got to try and avoid.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move on to a question about SPI-M commissioning. So I think this is for you, Louise. How many different efforts would be compared in order to form a consensus? And how often did SPI-M members produce significantly different results that had to be reconciled at the meeting?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's quite broad. So we would generally hope to have at least 3 different inputs to form a consensus. But it depended a little bit on what kind of thing we were thinking about. So if it was something super important, we were really hoping to have at least 3. So, for example, every week we were making the kind of our estimates, and the medium-term projections, as they are called. And there we definitely want to have at least 3 estimates, and if we have fewer, then we don't form a consensus.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. This one, I think, is probably for Adam. You've talked a lot about the sort of way that the information and the data flows moved during the course of the pandemic. Are there any significant data gaps that still exist that you think need to be filled?
I think, yeah. I think there's probably one within the UK and one globally. I think on a global level, actually just in a lot of places answering basic questions such as what's the mortality impact for COVID has been extremely difficult. And I think we saw some talks earlier today just about actually the challenge of documenting what's happened. And some of my colleagues have done work, for example, using machine learning on burial, on graveyards and this sort of thing to try and estimate, really indirect ways what's going on in those populations. I think one thing in the UK, and I think attention both for our understanding of transmission and for the control, is this ability to track and link data. We see countries in East Asia, one of my PhD students is working with Singapore, for example, and they have a lot more intensive ability to link individuals and their behaviours and the contacts and analyse those kind of data sources. And for privacy reasons, European countries haven't implemented the same kind of actions. And so I think if we want to answer questions such as what is the transmission risk amongst different individuals, what is the effectiveness of the contact tracing things we're implementing, for example, the app, which is designed to be fully privacy preserving in the UK, which is a really important feature, I think, for building trust and uptake, but it does give us a disadvantage in terms of our understanding of that network of transmission. So I think that's a tension, again, between privacy and wanting to protect individuals versus the understanding that would give us a public health insight. And I feel that we never really had that debate satisfactorily during the pandemic, and I think that's something we need to resolve before the next one, working out where we actually want to draw the line, rather than having this slightly implicit blurred line based on where people seem to have made decisions.
Thanks, Adam. That's really helpful. Question for everybody now. Uncertainty is a critical issue to communicate to policy. I think we've heard it from all the speakers today. How has your approach to this issue changed as a consequence of the pandemic? And I'll start with Chris for this one.
Right, that's a very hard question. So something I always teach my students is that a model without a quantification of uncertainty isn't a model. So any model has to have an understanding of the uncertainty within it, and that's part of the modelling process. The difficulty I've found, talking particularly to the media, is differentiating between being uncertain about a model and not believing in the model. So much of my work before COVID was in climate modelling, and all climate models have uncertainty, and it's essential that they have that uncertainty, because otherwise you're just telling a lie. But you have to say the uncertainty is measurable. It's within error bars. We know what those error bars are. And trying to convey the difference between that and saying we don't believe there's climate change, which isn't the case. So I think that's the difficulty, conveying the difference between being uncertain about something and not believing in something.
Thanks, Chris. Louise.
I think quantifying uncertainty is something that we need to work on as a field. So we're very good at quantifying parameter uncertainty within a model. So I have some data and I've got my model and I modify my parameters and I see how well my curve fits my data. And that gives me some idea of how different my parameters might be. Excellent, we're great at that. But how much do I believe my model? Was my model correct in the first place? Were there other mechanisms I should have included? Did I include mechanisms I shouldn't have done? That is much harder to quantify. And SPI-M attempts to do that by combining different modelling predictions together from different models. And I think that's probably a good approach, but we need to really think about what it is that we're doing, because, so we have problems sometimes. Maybe 1 week, my code didn't run, so I don't have an output. well, okay, now we don't have that model and it makes it difficult to compare week on week. And your uncertainty can kind of change week on week because you didn't put a model in. I think all of these things are things we need to have a good hard think about. And I don't have an answer, but it is a question.
Thanks, Louise. Adam, question or answer?
So I think a couple of aspects. So one, people love a single number. So in some situations when there's a lot of uncertainty, we actually just only reported the range. Early on, for example, we were trying to estimate what proportion of cases were actually being detected. And in a lot of countries, it was very low, even if you just reported the range, say you're 95% confident in. And that avoided those kind of single numbers being picked up. And in countries with large uncertainty, journalists couldn't pick a single number because they just didn't have access to one. I think just following on from Louise's important point, though, another thing that I think was a challenge in communication is, particularly as people who work on technical problems, if you're given, say, a scenario to look at, we've got a lot of experience in quantifying uncertainty around that specific question in terms of the parameters and what we do. I think what was a challenge in communication was the uncertainty actually in the underlying plausibility of those scenarios. And I think often a lot of people were much more interested in that rather than the range of uncertainty within the outcome of that scenario. So you might have something that's very nicely quantified for that particular set of events, but actually the way it's reported is these events are going to happen, this is what the scientists think. And so it's actually that uncertainty that wasn't being communicated, and I think it was just much a broader communication challenge which we need to think about moving beyond just the methods around a question.
And I think often that was quite well communicated to policymakers, but not necessarily to the public. So I think there was sometimes a misunderstanding of what evidence was guiding policy, because all you had as a member of the public was what was being said in the media, what was being said in press conferences, and the documents that were produced, but you didn't have that discussion that was happening at the same time. And I'm not sure how to solve that as a problem, but it did create this sort of difference of perspective, sitting as somebody who was sort of seeing all these conversations versus someone that didn't have access to that extra information.
And I guess that's one of the risks of working at the pace that we were working at, that not all bits of the system are working with the same level of knowledge or the same understanding, and that's something that you have to manage, isn't it, as part of that ongoing process. Okay, I'm conscious of time, but I'd like to finish with a one-sentence answer from each of the panellists, please, to this question, which is, what has been the main challenge to modelling? Chris.
Good luck.
Right. On a practical level, the main challenge has been trying to do an enormous amount of work very, very quickly with huge time constraints and produce a report at the end, which is a very practical but very realistic challenge, and my family has had to suffer the consequences. The practical one, of course, is for me trying to work very, very fast to develop models with not as much data as I'd like. So coming from a background in climate and weather forecasting, where we've had much longer and much more data, to do the transition to working much faster with much less data.
Thanks, Chris. Louise.
I mean, if I was going to have a one-word answer, I would say people. Maybe that's trite. I mean, trying to do things on a very fast timescale is incredibly difficult. And I think it means that as scientists, that's very challenging, because almost by the time you've produced the work, the situation has moved on. So certainly I have a lot of orphaned papers where nobody cares about the answer anymore. That was not really a one-sentence answer.
That's okay. I think we've all got those papers lying about. Yeah. Adam.
I think one of the major challenges was in real time distinguishing between possible explanations for a pattern we're seeing, given the fact we were using data that wasn't designed originally to help us answer that question.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So we're just about on 9:30. I'd like to thank everybody in the room. I'd like to thank all of those of you who've been watching us via the live stream online. Thank you very much for all the questions. They've been absolutely fantastic and have enriched the conversation. Most of all, I'd like to thank the panellists in the usual way for their fantastic contributions. So thank you very much indeed. And finally, a thank you for the Royal Society for putting this event on. I think it's really important that we take the time to take a step back and think about what we genuinely can learn from all the experiences we've had over the last 2 very difficult but challenging and fascinating from a scientific perspective. Please, those of you who are in the room, have a safe journey home. For those of you who are online, well, have a safe journey to the kettle. And with that, I will thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
I had a better sentence.